So here we are in your new soup business, Soup Hut, and you've got your location. And so when you enter into a lease, a lot of us have been renters. Probably most of us have signed a lease at some point in our lives, and we have a tendency when we lease an apartment to just be like, it's like a 2-page lease, we're like blah, 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 whatever, I'm just gonna sign it, I don't care what it says, yeah. But with a commercial lease, you're probably not gonna do that. You're gonna put a little bit more thought and detail into it, and I'll explain why. Well, here's the process, though, also that you might encounter when you're entering into a lease for a business space, like a retail space or commercial kitchen, is because commercial leases tend to be longer and a little more complicated. Usually what it starts out is 2 parties are negotiating. Next, they enter into a letter of intent, which could be like a 1- or 2-page letter that says, okay, here are the details of the lease. Here's how long the lease is going to last. Here's what type of business you're going to do in it, and so on. And once everybody's on the same page about the terms, then you kind of sign that letter of intent saying, okay, now we're going to draft a full lease agreement, and then you put that into writing. And honestly, I've seen lease agreements, commercial lease agreements, be as long as 40 pages. But don't be intimidated by that. If you actually sit down and read them, you end up learning that a lot of it is really relevant to your business. And so here are some of the things that you might find in one of those long lease agreements. First of all, the term of the lease, how long it is. And when you're a food business, you want to, especially if you're a retail business where people have to actually come and find you and sit down and eat there or get their food there, you don't want to end up having to move, because that'll really interrupt your business. And so you start off maybe negotiating a 3-year term, enough time to get your business off the ground and know if it's going to be successful in the long term. But usually what most commercial leases will have are these things called options, which means that at the end of the 3 years, you have the option as the food business to say, I want 1 more year, and I want the same lease terms as we had to begin with. So you have that right, and the landlord can't say no. So it's your decision, but you could also decide to walk away at that point. So you might end up negotiating a lease that gives you like a 1, 2, 3, maybe year term, maybe a handful of options, but at some point it's just going to end, because landlords don't want things to just go on forever and ever and ever, and that's the point at which you renegotiate. And a lot of times when you get to that point of renegotiation, you want to plan for the potential that the rent could go up quite a bit. That's when the landlord has the right to sort of come back and offer different terms. So the lease is going to say how much rent is, but it's not like your apartment rent. It's not like, hey, it's $1,000 a month or whatever. A lot of times rent will go up a little bit over time, so it might start really low. And in fact, most leases I've worked on have started at a very low rate, because most of the times businesses aren't making any money. They can't pay a lot of rent at first. So it might start out the first few months like very low rent, and then go up very quickly right after that. And then usually because market rates go up, the rent over time is going to go up maybe a little bit every year. But another thing, especially retail leases, like if you're going to have a restaurant space, a lot of times what the landlord might negotiate with you is having gross sales on top of rent. So maybe your rent is $2,000 a month. That's actually pretty good for most retail spaces. Usually it's a lot more. But in addition to $2,000 a month, you might pay a percentage of your gross sales. So maybe 2% of all of your sales, and maybe you're doing like selling $500,000 worth of soup every year, then that's going to be like, I think, $10,000 extra for the landlord for that year, if that's what you end up negotiating. And the nice thing about that is if your business is not doing well, then your rent is lower. But if your business is doing really well, then it's going to be higher. So it's a way that the landlord and the tenant kind of share the risk. And then usually, especially if you are in a building like a shopping center where there are other types of businesses in that space, you're going to end up paying something called common area maintenance, or CAM. And that is all the spaces like the public restrooms, like the walkway areas, the roof for the entire building, everything that the landlord is paying to maintain, they're probably going to ask you to pay a portion of it. So it's a really good idea to find out how much is that usually per month. Can you give me examples of what you've been charging tenants over the last few years? And you will end up with a surprise sometimes. I actually had a client who ended up having to pay $12,000 one month just because the roof needed to be replaced. And so you might want to negotiate around, like when major expenses come up like that, spreading them out over time or something. The lease is also going to detail how you can change the space. Are you able to sort of build it out, make holes in the walls and that type of thing? And it also specifies what do you take with you when you leave. Do you get to take the disco ball, or is it going to become a permanent fixture in the space? And actually, my dad has a friend who has a restaurant in Oregon who installed all of this really expensive kitchen equipment, and then the landlord terminated the lease and said, oh, you don't get to take that equipment with you, that's permanent installation. And they actually brought out the police in bulletproof vests when she was taking all of her equipment out because they were so scared the landlord was going to do something crazy. And so these can be contentious things, but if you really clarify them in a lease, they're less likely to become drama. The lease is also going to just say what other areas of the building do you have access to, what do your customers have access to as far as parking, restrooms, and so on. Do you get any extra storage space, all that. Now, also a very important thing to talk about is what areas are you responsible for maintaining and what areas is the landlord responsible for maintaining. And so this actually comes up quite a bit, like if a pipe leaks, is that the landlord's responsibility if it's leaking into your unit, or is it yours because it's affecting your unit? And so being really specific about every part of the building, just think about every fixture, every pipe, every wire, window, who has to maintain that. Commercial leases a lot of times also specify that the landlord could not let other people come in and compete with you, because if you start a business that's a soup business, and then it's like, who's this lady starting a stew business right next to my soup business? Like, landlord, you shouldn't let this happen. But if you don't want that to happen, you got to put it in the lease. Landlords will also set some requirements around signage because they don't want you to have something hideous and large like this. They're usually going to want to constrict like the size and the appearance or the colors to make it look more consistent with the scheme of the space. And then another thing you're going to want to do is just negotiate for what purposes can you use this space? Because what if you do go out of business after a year, but you have a 3-year lease? You're not going to have to just keep paying rent. What you would normally do is find another tenant to come in and use the space, and then either take over that lease or kind of be like your subtenant for the next couple of years. And so could your friend with his dog washing business come in there? A lot of times landlords want to just keep certain types of businesses in their space. They might not want some smelly wet dogs running around their space, but maybe other things could be more appealing, like a lawyer hut. And it's funny I should mention that because we just started a lawyer hut, and it's called the Resilient Communities Legal Cafe, and Ricardo already mentioned it earlier, but we are hanging out in cafes giving legal advice now. So I just thought I'd throw that in there.